Hello and welcome back to Beauty Bee. Let's start out a little differently today and talk about what this video is not, rather than what it is. This is not a, if you have these palettes, then you don't need Natasha Denona versions, nor is it, if you want this color story, then this palette is what you need. We're taking need entirely out of this equation. You don't need eye makeup. However, I do think that it is worthwhile to talk about less expensive alternatives. I quite often will do tutorials and self-promotion alert. I will absolutely link that up in the cards. And I often say in those videos that duping the vibes or things similar to a tutorial are a really good way to test out a color scheme. Even if you are still interested in buying the palette, afterwards it's often helpful to decide if it's really worth it to you to purchase all of those shades in one convenient package. So today we are looking at some drugstore to lower mid-range alternatives to Natasha Denona palettes. We're looking at a subset of the palettes today. We're looking at 8 of her bigger palettes. Now these are very, very pricey palettes. They range from $65 for the quote-unquote cheapest option all the way up to $169, which is a lot for color dust to put on your face. That is bizarre to me. We can talk about this weird desensitization that the beauty community as a whole seems to have gone through regarding makeup prices in the last few years some other time, but goodness. I also want to mention before we get into things that these are not going to be perfect dupes by any means. If you are interested in exact dupes of Natasha Denona palettes, I am sure that you can Google Natasha Denona dupe and find things that fit your interests. Let's start with the cheaper palettes and then work our way up to the larger and more expensive options. The first is the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I do love how she names some of these palettes, like, yes, this is the Bronze palette, and it is indeed very much a bronze palette. I found this one actually fairly easy to find alternatives for. The one that I'm showing here is from Lorac. It is their Unzipped Unauthorized palette. It is a 5-pan, but really, I don't think you get a whole lot more variety with the 15-pan Natasha Denona palette. Yes, you are missing some mattes, but if you are considering purchasing a $65 eye palette, you likely already have at least some eyeshadow and some neutral mattes that you could bring into this look. You do get pretty much the full variety of shimmers that the Natasha Denona palette offers. Also, this palette's $25, so for a little more than a third of the price, I think it would be worth considering. Next up, we have my personal favorite of her line, the Glam Palette. Now, full disclosure, if there is one palette from Natasha Denona that I would actually consider purchasing, or at least one of the larger palettes, it would be this one. I love gray eyeshadow. I think this is stunning. However, again, $65, we can repeat the same spiel from last time. I think that a reasonable approximation of this palette comes from Nabla in their Cutie Platinum palette. There are 4 shades in this palette that look like they could have come directly from the Natasha Denona Glam, and I actually think you're getting a little bit more versatility because this brown in the Nabla palette goes a little bit warmer than anything in the Natasha Denona palette, and I think that broadens your horizons as far as the number and variety of different looks you could actually achieve with this. And it's $24. But a palette that seems to be getting quite a bit of love, pun not intended, but appreciated, this year is the Natasha Denona Love Palette. It's pink and purple, it's perfect for Valentine's Day, and I think that a really good alternative comes from ColourPop and the Ooh La La palette. Now, just like the Natasha Denona palette, the ColourPop is largely focused around these pinks. The Natasha Denona palette does extend a little bit further into purple than the ColourPop does, though it does also have a purple. Both the ColourPop and the Natasha Denona palettes also have some lighter neutral shimmers and a burgundy. And while this ColourPop palette is definitely not a spot-on dupe by any means, I do think you could achieve a lot of the looks that you would get out of that Love palette with the Ooh La La palette. Here's another one that pulls on my heartstrings, Biba. Now, I think I like this largely because of that late 60s inspiration. However, it is also a really pretty palette. I think you could argue that any really comprehensive neutral palette would probably be a decent dupe for the Biba palette. However, in this video, I'm going to focus on the e.l.f. New Neutrals palette. I actually wonder if e.l.f. somewhat intended this as a dupe for Biba. Like the Biba palette, it goes from warm to sort of neutral nude shades and then extends into grays. Certainly it's not presenting itself as a dupe. There are 18 shades in the e.l.f. palette to start with compared to 15 in the Natasha Denona, but I think it could definitely function as a near dupe, or as I was originally considering calling this video, an close enough stand-in for Natasha Denona. Also, it's $14, so that hurts a lot less than $129. We're keeping with the same line with my dupe for the gold palette. This is the e.l.f. Earthen Ocean palette. This is another one where I actually think you get more variety with the so-called dupe palette. Yes, you get those golds and those greens, and we venture into those warm blues in Earthen Ocean, but we also go a little bit further. Again, we've got 18 pans to play with here rather than 15, and e.l.f. makes use of that to go into a more cool blue and silver. And again, it's $14 compared to $129, and you get a little bit more variety here. If you are really interested in purchasing the Natasha Gold palette, $129 price tag and all, I do think it might be worthwhile to at least try out the e.l.f. Earthen Oceans palette and just see how it works out for you and see if you feel afterwards that the Natasha Denona palette is still worthwhile. Even if there's only maybe a 30% chance that that e.l.f. palette really does scratch the itch, I think that the expected amount that you end up paying will likely be quite a bit less. I'll insert the math here and we can see if that works out. I'm certain it does. Next up, we have the Sunrise palette. I think this is the first of the $129 palettes. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I also suspect that a lot of you know what my dupe palette is going to be. It's the ColourPop Yes Please palette, which was actually their first of these 12-pan palettes. These two are pretty similar. I think it was brought up in pretty much all of the early review videos that the ColourPop provided a good alternative, and I think that's still true. Now, Metropolis is a little bit of a different beast. This is a 28-pan palette. It's still that $129 price tag, so as much as you can say you're being thrifty with Natasha Denona, maybe. However, it is largely a grungy rainbow with a lot of varieties of gold in it. And that's how I decided to approach my potential dupe. Now, because this is a $129 palette, I didn't feel too bad about picking two $18 palettes to be the stand-ins. We have first the Raw Beauty Christie palette. I think I mentioned that this was probably a pretty good dupe for Subculture, but I also think that Metropolis leans on some of the similar tones that Subculture and therefore the Raw Beauty Christie palette takes on. Additionally, with another ColourPop palette, going for the gold, you get that nice variety of golds as well as some of those neutrals that the Natasha Denona palette does have, even though when I look at it, I feel like I don't see a neutral for quite a while. Like it takes me a minute to see the neutrals among the sea of color. And now finally, the Star palette. This is an 18 pan palette and it retails for $169. Oh my goodness. Again with this one, like the Metropolis, I've used two palettes to sort of dupe the vibes. The Star palette is also really conducive to doing this because it very clearly splits the palette into two halves. For the left half, I chose as a stand-in the BH Cosmetics Golden Twilight palette. It is quite similar. It goes gold to green to blue. I almost feel like this half of the palette is a somewhat toned down version of the gold palette. On the right half of the palette, which is actually the side that appeals a little bit more to me, I chose the Lorac Unzipped Elegance palette. It's another one of their quints, and again, it's quite a similar color story. You've got the peach, you've got the shimmery, sort of grayish neutrals, a burgundy, and the two of these palettes together would be $37. Though you can almost always find a sale on BH, and I suspect that it is not too hard to score a deal on Lorac as well. I hope this was interesting. Clearly, this list of similar palettes is not exhaustive, and I really would encourage you, if you are interested in any of these Natasha Denona palettes, to first have a look through your collection, see what you have that's similar. These are a huge amount of money to lay down just in general, but in particular, if you already have really similar things and it's not adding a lot of value, the functionality that you're getting out of that, let's say, $129 likely isn't there. Now, hopefully this didn't come off as too preachy. If it did, apologies. If you have these Natasha Denona palettes and you enjoy them and you think they're great and worth every penny, that is truly fantastic, and I'm glad that the money that you put into those palettes feels worth it now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll consider liking and subscribing if you enjoyed, and I hope I will see you next time. Bye!